The echo of my crutches against the polished courtroom floor struck like a drumbeat announcing war. Every step jarred my healing bones, but I forced myself upright chin high, refusing to let anyone see weakness. I wanted them to see me walk in. I wanted them to understand that I was alive. At the plaintiff's table sat my mother Evelyn, elegant in a dark suit, her lips pressed into the thin line of someone convinced victory was already in her grasp. Beside her, Danielle flipped casually through papers, her expression smug as though she were the star of a stage play. My father Charles leaned slightly back in his chair, avoiding everyone's eyes the way he had done my entire life. The quiet shadow who signed whatever my mother placed before him. Their lawyer whispered to them confident, oblivious to what was about to unfold. The moment Evelyn looked up and her eyes met mine, the color drained from her face. Danielle's hand froze mid-page. For a heartbeat, the entire room went still, as if the air itself had been sucked away. Then came the sound, raw and piercing Danielle's scream ripping across the silence, a sound of disbelief and terror combined. Evelyn staggered, her hand gripping the table. Papers scattered across the floor. The judge pounded the gavel, calling for order, but my gaze never left theirs. I stood my breath steady, though inside my chest burned with months of rage and betrayal. I had lived for this moment to walk into this place where they had declared me dead and show every soul present that I had survived. The jurors whispered wide-eyed. The attorneys shifted, caught between professional masks and human shock. My lawyer, Mark, placed a steady hand on my arm. "This is my client," he said to the court. "She is alive. She has been alive all along, despite the lies." The judge turned his piercing gaze on Evelyn. She trembled visibly. Charles shifted uncomfortably, the man who had signed documents that almost buried me alive. Danielle's lips quivered, her eyes wild, her perfect hair suddenly meaningless. I tightened my grip on the crutch and took another step forward toward the witness stand. Every movement carried the weight of nights when I thought I would never wake again, when pain blurred with fear, when silence became proof that I had been erased. In that room, their collapse was my resurrection. I remembered the screech of tires, the slam of metal, the sting of shattered glass slicing into my skin. I remembered the crushing blackness of the night when they thought they had rid themselves of me forever. And now I remembered it with new power, because here, before a jury and every curious eye, I was the ghost that refused to vanish. The tension thickened until even the bailiff shifted nervously. Evelyn's carefully built world of lies was cracking in real time. Danielle pressed both palms flat on the table as if to stop herself from fainting. Charles cleared his throat, but his words died unspoken. I looked at them and thought of the forged death certificate with my name, the frozen bank accounts, the life they had tried to steal. I thought of nights in the hospital when no one came of how betrayal burns colder than any wound. And now this was the stage where truth would detonate. The judge demanded order again, but the murmur would not settle. I raised my voice, steady and sharp. "I am Rachel Miller," I said, "and I am not dead." A hush fell like a heavy curtain. Even those who had doubted now stared as though a miracle had walked in on crutches. Evelyn whispered something, her face pale, her hands trembling. Danielle shook her head violently as if by refusing to believe she could erase what stood in front of her. Charles looked at the ceiling, refusing eye contact, a man already drowning in guilt. But guilt would not save him now. My survival had turned their scheme inside out, and from this moment on, everything they had done in darkness would be dragged into light. The courtroom was not just a place of law that day. It was an arena. And I was not merely a victim. I was living proof that their attempt to erase me had failed. The trial had not yet begun, but I knew already that the war had shifted. For the first time in my life, the power was mine. The night that was supposed to be ordinary became the night they tried to erase me. It was late, the air damp with drizzle. The kind of evening when the streets looked half asleep. I had just finished a long shift at the hospital and was driving home with my bag tossed on the passenger seat. My phone buzzed, and when I picked up, I saw Danielle's name. I hesitated. She rarely called me unless she wanted something, but exhaustion and habit made me answer. Her voice came through sweet, almost too sweet. "Rachel," she said, "I need your help. My car broke down near the Old Mill Road. I am stuck and I do not know who else to call. Please come." Something in her tone felt rehearsed, but I told myself she was my sister. Even with the history of cruelty, even with the years of being treated as the lesser child, I still responded. I turned onto the road she named. It was dark, lined with trees, the kind of place you would not expect anyone to be at that hour. I slowed down, expecting to see her car with hazard lights blinking, but there was nothing. No car, no Danielle. The road was empty except for the glow of my headlights against wet asphalt. Confusion prickled in my chest. I reached for my phone to call her back. That was when I saw them. Headlights in the rearview mirror growing larger with unnatural speed. My pulse spiked. Before I could react, the engine roared behind me and the blinding high beams flooded my mirrors. The truck was massive, barreling toward me. I pressed the gas panic, exploding in my chest, but the truck slammed into my bumper with a bone-rattling crash. Metal screamed. My head snapped forward and pain shot down my spine. I fought to control the wheel, the drizzle turning the road slick, but the truck rammed me again harder. My car skidded the guardrail, flashing on the side. I tried to brake, tried to breathe, but the third impact hurled me sideways. Glass shattered around me like a storm of knives. My body jolted as if every bone had been struck at once. The airbag exploded, choking me with the smell of burning chemicals. My vision blurred red and black. Somewhere in the chaos, I swore I heard footsteps' laughter carried faint through the rain. Danielle's laughter, or maybe my mind betrayed me. My chest heaved, blood pooling on my tongue. The truck's lights vanished into the night, leaving me broken in the twisted shell of my car. I remember the horn blaring endlessly, the sound jagged against the silence that followed. Then everything collapsed into blackness. When I drifted in and out of that darkness, I remembered a shape at the edge of vision. A familiar car slowing down, pausing. Through cracked lids, I glimpsed a silhouette I knew all too well. My father Charles sat in the driver's seat staring at the wreck. For one suspended moment, I thought he would stop, rush out, call for help. But instead, his car rolled forward, tires hissing on wet asphalt, and disappeared. He had seen his youngest daughter bleeding and broken, and he had chosen to keep driving. The betrayal stung worse than the broken bones. My mind wanted to scream, but my body was limp. The world tilted again and dissolved. That night branded itself into me not only the violence of steel and glass, but the deeper violence of family. They had summoned me to this road like bait, unleashed a monster of metal, and left me to die. Danielle's call had been a trap. My mother's influence whispered behind it, and my father's silence sealed it. When I finally woke in the hospital, days later, tubes in my veins and machines breathing for me, I would piece it together. But in that moment on that wet road, I was certain of one thing. My own family had tried to end me, and somehow I was still alive. From the moment I could form memories, my life was shaped by the hierarchy of our home. Danielle, the eldest, was the golden child, the chosen heir, the bright star who could do no wrong, while I was the shadow expected to adapt, to shrink, to absorb blame, so that she could shine. I remember Evelyn, my mother, standing in the kitchen one afternoon when I was barely 6, her hand gripping my arm after Danielle had pushed me and broken my toy. "Do not upset your sister," Evelyn warned, her voice sharp with authority. "She is sensitive. She deserves better." I had not done anything but cry yet in her eyes. I was guilty. My father Charles sat at the table, newspaper open, eyes flicking once toward me before lowering again, as if retreating into silence could make the injustice disappear. Silence was his specialty. Over the years, Danielle learned that no matter what she did, Evelyn would protect her. She would tear pages from my favorite books, then smile sweetly when Evelyn came into the room and claim I had given them to her. She would whisper lies small and poisonous until punishment came down on me. When I was grounded for an entire week at age 10 because Danielle insisted I had stolen $5 from her purse, I saw Charles watching quietly, hands folded, making no attempt to defend me, though he must have known the truth. It was easier for him to keep the peace by letting me bear the weight. By the time I was a teenager, the pattern was cemented. Danielle mocked my clothing choices, my hair, my voice. At family dinners, she would toss off cutting remarks about my grades or my friends, and Evelyn would laugh indulgently as though sarcasm was wit. Charles would chew slowly eyes on his plate. In that silence, I learned that even his quiet was a form of betrayal because it told Danielle and Evelyn they could do anything without consequence. Once when I was 16, I told my parents I wanted to apply for a summer program in another city. Evelyn's face hardened immediately. "That is not for you. You belong here helping your sister." Danielle smirked across the table, knowing she had won again. Charles signed the withdrawal form without a word. I felt the cage lock tighter. The few times I tried to resist the consequences came fast. Evelyn slapped me across the face when I questioned why Danielle's needs always came first. Danielle spread rumors among relatives that I was unstable, exaggerating every moment of frustration until even my aunts and uncles looked at me with suspicion. And Charles signed whatever document Evelyn pushed across the counter. At 18, when I wanted to rent a small apartment, she produced papers declaring me financially irresponsible. Charles signed them, and the landlord declined my application. I ended up back home, the walls closing in. Danielle thrived under this system. She managed the family's finances, organized their social life, even scheduled doctor's appointments. She moved through life like a queen while I bent under invisible chains. I learned to adapt by becoming small. Invisible, surviving on scraps of autonomy. Choosing a hairstyle Danielle disliked felt like rebellion. Spending time with a friend outside her circle felt like victory. But each victory was fragile, quickly crushed by Evelyn's wrath or Danielle's icy silence. Their control was complete, reinforced by Charles's signatures and silences, and by the time I reached my 20s, I had accepted that my place was to be unseen. Yet even in those suffocating years, I carried a spark. I dreamed of freedom in quiet moments, imagined a life where decisions belonged to me, where I did not have to ask permission. That spark kept me alive, though I did not know then that it would one day ignite in the fire of betrayal and survival. Looking back from the distance of the courtroom and the hospital, I see it clearly. My family had been building toward that night of attempted erasure for years. The accident on the road was not a sudden act of violence, but the inevitable culmination of a childhood where I had been treated as expendable. Evelyn had preached loyalty but practiced domination. Danielle had wielded cruelty like a weapon sharpened over decades. And Charles had provided the signatures and the silence that gave their cruelty legitimacy. That was the foundation of the life I was born into. That was the weight pressing on my shoulders as I walked with crutches into the courtroom years later. And that was why I would no longer remain silent. The first time I opened my eyes after the crash, the world was nothing but white light and pain. Fluorescent bulbs buzzed overhead, my chest ached with every shallow breath, and the beeping of monitors tethered me to consciousness. Tubes ran into my arms, an oxygen mask pressed against my face, and a brace encased my left leg from thigh to ankle. A nurse leaned over me, her voice gentle but urgent, telling me to stay still. "You were in a bad accident," she said. "You are in the hospital now." Her words swam around me like fragments of a dream, but the one question that pushed through my haze was simple. "My family, are they here?" She paused, her eyes flickering away. "No one has come." At first, I thought she must be mistaken. Maybe she had not checked. Maybe they were on their way. Days blurred into each other, and still the doorway to my room remained empty. Nurses rotated shifts. Doctors explained injuries, but no familiar voice called my name. I asked again and again. The charge nurse finally told me in hushed tones that my mother had visited once. My heart lifted for a second, only to collapse when the nurse added that Evelyn had not asked about my condition. She had gone straight to administration requesting copies of my medical records and a provisional death certificate. When they refused, saying I was alive, she had left without even glancing through the glass window at my broken body. The sting of betrayal seared deeper than any wound. Danielle never appeared. Charles never called. I lay there with ribs fractured, head throbbing, leg shattered, waiting for someone who would never come. In the quiet hours of the night, I stared at ceiling tiles and tried to convince myself there had been a mistake. Families do not abandon their children, do they? But as the minutes turned to hours and hours to days, the truth settled heavy in my chest. They were not coming because they had chosen not to. I overheard nurses whispering in the hallway. One said she had seen my mother at the nurses' station filling out forms for insurance. Another mentioned that Danielle had been spotted in the parking lot but had not entered the building. The realization crawled over me like ice. They were preparing for a life without me, orchestrating paperwork as if my body lying in that bed was nothing more than an inconvenience. Charles's absence spoke as loudly as Evelyn's paperwork. He had always been the one who could have stepped in, the one who could have said no. Yet again, he had chosen silence. I imagined him at home in his chair, hands folded, pretending ignorance while signatures moved across forms that declared me gone. The thought hollowed me out. On the fourth night, a nurse with kind eyes named Carla, not the investigator I would later meet, but another woman who worked the night shift, leaned over me and whispered that she was sorry. Sorry that my family had not come. Sorry that she had to watch me wait. Her words cracked something inside me. For the first time, tears spilled hot down my cheeks, not from pain in my bones, but from the ache of being discarded like an unwanted possession. The physical agony was sharp, but the loneliness gnawed deeper. I tried to call Danielle. Voicemail. I left message after message, voice trembling, begging her to come. No reply. I called Charles. His line rang and rang before going dead. Once I received a text from my mother. "Hope you are resting." 4 words colder than the hospital air. They did not visit, but bills did. Envelopes arrived marked urgent, demanding payment even as I lay immobile. When I tried to pay with my debit card, the transaction declined. Confused, I called the bank. After endless transfers, a representative explained my accounts had been frozen due to a report of my death. My mouth went dry. I told them I was alive, speaking to them right then, but they refused to proceed without official verification. I hung up with my pulse hammering, the room spinning, and the horrifying thought that my family had not only abandoned me but had begun erasing me on paper. In the dim hospital nights, the machines hummed like a dirge, and I realized my fight was no longer only for survival of my body. It was for survival of my existence itself. They had tried to end me on that wet road. Now they were trying to bury me in bureaucracy. My body ached, my mind reeled, but a small ember of defiance flared. If they would not come for me in love, then I would face them with truth. Alone, betrayed, but alive, and that I began to realize was enough to start a war. The morning Mark Benson walked into my hospital room changed everything. I had met him only once before when he reviewed the contract for my small house, but now he arrived with a leather briefcase and the kind of expression that said he carried news too heavy to soften. He pulled a chair close to my bed, leaned forward, and lowered his voice as if the walls themselves might be listening. "Rachel," he said, "I have something you need to see." From his case, he drew a folder thick with documents. My pulse thudded as he spread the first page on the tray table. It was a death certificate. My name was printed in bold letters across the top. Cause of death: injuries sustained in a motor vehicle collision. Date: the night of the crash. For a long second, my brain refused to process. I was staring at proof of my own death. Beneath the line marked informant was a signature. My father's. Charles Miller. I felt the blood drain from my face. Mark watched me carefully. "There is more," he said, and laid out the next paper. A life insurance policy worth $5 million, naming Evelyn Miller as the sole beneficiary. The paperwork had been submitted within 24 hours of the accident. Attached was a notarized affidavit from Danielle, asserting that I had no surviving dependents and that the estate should pass directly to my mother. The walls seemed to close in. My breath came shallow, pressing against fractured ribs. My family had not simply abandoned me. They had declared me dead and positioned themselves to collect. Mark continued calmly, methodically. "The bank accounts you could not access were frozen because copies of this certificate were sent to them. The new house you bought was nearly transferred to Evelyn. The only reason it failed was because the notary stamp did not match records." I pressed my hand to my forehead, the pounding in my skull matching the pounding in my chest. I had known betrayal before, but this was annihilation. Evelyn had not just lied, she had crafted an entire narrative where I ceased to exist. Danielle had supplied the details, Charles had signed his name, and together they had built a paper grave. Mark placed a third document in front of me, a guardianship petition claiming I was incapacitated and unable to manage my affairs. Evelyn sought full control. Reading the language felt like being smothered. Words like cognitively impaired and permanent disability stared back at me. They had planned not only for my death, but for the possibility of my survival. Either way, they would own everything. I asked Mark how this was possible. His jaw tightened. Forgery and collusion, he said. Serious crimes. But proving intent is key. That is where you come in. I stared at the pages at the ink strokes that carried the weight of erasure. My father's signature haunted me. The man who should have defended me had instead validated the lie of my death. My mother was poised to claim millions. My sister had provided testimony to secure it. The magnitude staggered me. For a moment, despair threatened to pull me under the sense that I was powerless against a family willing to sign away my life. But then another emotion rose sharper. Rage. Not the wild rage that blinds, but a cold, clear determination. They had underestimated me. They believed I was too weak, too broken to fight back. They believed I would remain a ghost, a line of ink on forged certificates. But I was breathing. I was alive. And I was ready to confront them. Mark outlined a plan. We would gather evidence, not rush. Forged documents were strong proof, but he suspected more. Financial records witnesses, maybe even direct admissions. He suggested bringing in a private investigator. I nodded, the decision burning into me like iron. For the first time since the accident, I felt something solid beneath me. A path. When Mark left, I stared at the folder long into the night. The paper was thin, but the lies it carried could have obliterated my existence. That they had nearly succeeded chilled me. That they would fail ignited me. I thought of Evelyn's cold smile, Danielle's smirk, Charles's empty eyes. They had built this scheme for money, but it was more than greed. It was control. It was the final act of domination in a life where they had always placed me last. This time they would learn that the shadow they tried to erase had claws. This time the hierarchy would collapse, and I, Rachel Miller, would be the one to bring it down. The days after Mark revealed the documents became a blur of phone calls, whispers from nurses, and the gnawing weight of betrayal that refused to leave my chest. My accounts remained frozen, my new house technically no longer mine, and the silence from my family thickened into something suffocating. It was not just abandonment now, it was active erasure. Then one evening, as rain lashed the hospital windows, my phone buzzed. Danielle. For a moment, I considered ignoring it, but curiosity and old habits forced me to answer. Her voice flowed with mock concern, each syllable wrapped in sugar and poison. "How are you feeling, little sister?" she asked, as if she had not left me to die. I said nothing at first, only listening to the rustle of papers in the background. Finally, I forced out that I was alive, hurting, but alive. Her tone shifted colder. "Rest is what you need. Do not worry about anything else. Mother and father are handling everything. You do not have to trouble yourself with finances or decisions." Her words twisted like knives. It was gaslighting at its purest. She was telling me that my survival meant nothing, that I was too fragile to think, too incompetent to act. I told her firmly I would be taking care of my own affairs. Silence stretched, then she laughed softly. "Rachel, you always overestimate yourself. Do not make this harder." I hung up before I screamed, my hands trembling. Hours later, a text arrived from my father. Short, cold. "Listen to your mother. She knows best." That was all. The man who had seen my body broken on the roadside, who had signed my death certificate, now instructed me to submit quietly. It was a betrayal so sharp it cut deeper than my broken ribs. Evelyn never called directly, but I received a formal notice through the hospital that she had filed another petition to act as my guardian. The language of that paper stripped me of dignity, describing me as incapable, incompetent, unfit. Reading it felt like suffocating all over again. In the hallways, I overheard nurses whispering that Evelyn was presenting herself publicly as the grieving mother of a daughter taken too soon. Danielle accompanied her radiant and solemn, while Charles trailed behind, signing papers validating the performance. Outside these sterile walls, the narrative had shifted fully. According to them, I was already gone. My bank declined my attempts to access even a few dollars. The insurance company called confused, asking for verification because two conflicting reports existed, one declaring my death and one confirming my hospitalization. The representative admitted that Evelyn had already tried to claim benefits, her application supported by Danielle's affidavit, and Charles's notarized approval. Hearing it confirmed what I already knew. They were united, a trinity of betrayal. And yet within their unity, cracks began to show. Danielle's tone on the phone carried an edge of desperation, as though she feared I might recover and speak. Charles's text betrayed a man weary of pressure yet too cowardly to resist. Evelyn's silence was perhaps the loudest, the silence of a predator waiting for a chance to strike again. Alone in my bed, monitors humming, I replayed every word, every document, every memory. They wanted me to doubt myself, to question my sanity, to surrender. That had been the pattern since childhood. When I cried, I was told I was dramatic. When I resisted, I was told I was unstable. Now, after surviving the crash, they were deploying the same tactic on a larger scale. Gaslight her until she breaks. Convince the world she is either dead or incompetent. Take everything. But this time, I saw it clearly. This time, their words did not pierce me. They fueled me. For the first time in my life, I refused to bend. I would gather proof. I would expose them. And when the truth came to light, every signature, every lie, every manipulative word would be nailed to their names forever. The day Mark returned with a woman beside him marked the first shift from despair to strategy. She introduced herself as Carla Jones, a private investigator with sharp eyes that missed nothing and a calm voice that suggested she had walked through darker alleys than mine. She shook my hand firmly and said, "Rachel, if they wanted you erased, then we are going to carve your truth into stone." I clung to those words like a lifeline. Carla began by laying out photographs, financial printouts, and handwritten notes across the tray table that had once held my untouched hospital meals. The first photo was grainy security footage from a cafe downtown showing Evelyn and Danielle leaning close across a table, heads bowed together. Their lips moved in conversation, their expressions tense, their gestures quick. According to the audio captured by a nearby source, Evelyn had said, "Once the paperwork clears, the money will be safe," and Danielle had replied, "She will not be around to interfere." Hearing it recorded made bile rise in my throat. Carla moved on to bank statements. Danielle had withdrawn $5,000 in cash a few days before the crash. That money had been traced to an account belonging to a man connected to freight trucks. It was not proof by itself, but it was another thread tying Danielle to the night of my so-called accident. Then came the documents bearing Charles's signature. Carla tapped them with her finger. He was the legitimizer, she explained. Without his signature, the death certificate, the guardianship petition, the bank authorizations would not have held weight. He may look quiet, but he is complicit. My chest tightened. I knew it was true, but hearing it in Carla's steady tone carved the reality deeper. She flipped to another page, a neighbor's sworn statement that Charles had been seen loitering near the hospital multiple times during the week after my crash. Not once had he entered my room. Not once had he asked a nurse about me. He had hovered on the periphery, then vanished. It painted the picture of a man who knew exactly what was happening but chose not to disrupt the plan. My stomach knotted. This was not negligence. It was choice. Carla looked me in the eye. "They are operating as a unit, but units crack under pressure. Your sister is arrogant. Your mother is calculating. Your father is weak. Together they think they are untouchable, but we can break them." I listened, absorbing every detail, the seed of defiance sprouting into determination. Mark outlined legal steps, careful, deliberate. Carla spoke of surveillance, discreet cameras baiting them into revealing themselves. For the first time, I felt like I was not fighting alone. That night, I asked a nurse I trusted to help conceal a small camera in my room. It was angled toward my bed, subtle enough to escape notice. My plan was simple. I would lure them close, let them believe I was fragile and unaware, then capture their words and deeds. To set the bait, I asked my friend Marcy to send Danielle a message. "Tell her I am awake. Tell her I remember. Tell her I am about to talk." I knew my sister too well to believe she would ignore such bait. She would come driven by fear of exposure, and Evelyn would follow seeking control. Charles Buford suspected would linger in the shadows as he always did. The days that followed were tense with anticipation. Every creak in the hallway made my pulse race. Nurses whispered support, some of them having already chosen sides, after witnessing my isolation. They knew cruelty when they saw it. I clutched that knowledge like armor. When Danielle finally appeared, her heels clicking sharply against tile, my heart pounded, but my face remained calm. She smiled saccharine and brittle, carrying a bouquet she never looked at again. "You look better than I expected," she said, eyes flicking to the machines monitoring me. I thanked her coolly and asked why she had not visited before. She claimed she had been busy handling my affairs. My affairs. I pressed asking about the insurance about the banks. Her expression tightened. "Someone has been filling your head with nonsense," she said, stepping closer. "You need rest, not rumors." I asked if the rumors included a death certificate with my name. For a flicker of a second, her mask cracked. She recovered quickly, tilting her head in that condescending way. "You always had an imagination." But the camera caught it all. Every twitch, every lie. I let silence hang before saying, "My attorney has copies." Her lips parted in surprise, fury flashing before she smoothed her features. "You are making a mistake," she whispered. "This could have been handled quietly." I shook my head. "The time for quiet is over." That was when Evelyn entered her perfume, filling the room before her words. Her tone was sharp cold. "Stop this, Rachel. Stop pretending you can fight. You are weak. You are nothing without us." The camera recorded her venom, every syllable a weapon. Behind her in the hallway, I glimpsed Charles standing, rigid eyes darting but feet unmoving. He would not enter, but he would not stop them either. I let them speak, let their arrogance reveal itself while inside me a fire blazed. With Carla's files, Mark's guidance, and this footage, I finally held weapons of my own. They thought they could gaslight me into silence, but I was documenting every word. They thought their scheme was airtight, but cracks had already spread. I was no longer the invisible child in the family hierarchy. I was the survivor building her case. And soon, in a courtroom packed with eyes and ears, the truth would explode and burn them to ash. The night the storm raged outside, with thunder shaking the windows, became the night they revealed just how far they were willing to go. I had left the bait in place, the whispers that I remembered, everything, the suggestion that I might speak to the police. My body was still weak ribs, aching, head pounding, but my mind was sharper than ever. The camera, hidden discreetly above the bed, blinked red for a moment before blending into the shadows. I waited, pulse loud in my ears. Just after midnight, the door creaked open. Evelyn entered first, her heels muted against the linoleum, a bouquet clutched in one hand, though her eyes never glanced at it. Danielle followed, her arms crossed tightly, scanning the machines as if calculating. My father lingered in the hallway, visible through the crack of the door, his posture tense, his hand tapping nervously against the frame. Evelyn set the bouquet down untouched and turned to me with a smile so false it made my skin crawl. "You look so tired, Rachel," she murmured, brushing invisible dust from the edge of the bed. Her hand slid toward the IV pump. Danielle moved closer, whispering, "If she talks, everything falls apart." Evelyn nodded slightly, her fingers adjusting the morphine drip. My breath froze. The dosage climbed incrementally, almost imperceptible but deadly if left unchecked. My eyelids fluttered as I forced myself to feign drowsiness, my fingers inching toward the call button hidden beneath the blanket. Danielle leaned in, her voice a razor. "It would be better if you slept forever." My chest burned with rage, but I held still, letting their arrogance spill into words the camera captured perfectly. Evelyn whispered, "Just relax, darling. We will take care of everything." Behind her in the hallway, Charles shifted his weight, glanced once at me, then looked away. He raised a hand in a subtle motion, a signal for them to hurry. My stomach twisted. He was not a bystander. He was complicit, even if his cowardice cloaked him. The morphine hissed, the monitor beeped irregularly, and my head grew heavier. But then I pressed the call button. The alarm blared. Nurses rushed in like a tide, their faces sharp with suspicion. Evelyn stepped back quickly, her hands lifted as if innocent. Danielle hissed under her breath, eyes blazing. The nurse checked the pump, her brows knitting at the sudden spike. "What are you doing?" she demanded. Evelyn's tone turned indignant. "She is in pain. I was just trying to comfort her." The nurse's eyes narrowed. "That is not your role. Leave. Now." Danielle grabbed Evelyn's arm, tugging her toward the door, whispering furiously. "This was a mistake." Charles vanished down the hall like smoke, his cowardice retreating into the dark. The nurses stabilized me, adjusting the dosage, checking my vitals, their voices clipped and efficient. I lay still, my heart hammering, my mind searing the moment into memory. The camera had caught it all. Evelyn's hand on the pump, Danielle's damning words, Charles's signal. Later, when the room finally quieted and the storm outside subsided, I replayed the scene in my head. They had crossed the line from fraud to attempted murder, not on a deserted road, but within hospital walls. That arrogance, that hubris would be their undoing. I knew now that survival was not just about breathing. It was about capturing proof, and proof was what I had. The footage was clear, the words undeniable. They thought I was too weak, too broken, but they had forgotten that pain sharpens. They had forgotten that the invisible daughter was no longer invisible. And as I closed my eyes that night, the IV steady again, I knew one truth with blazing certainty. They had tried to end me twice. The third attempt would not come because by then the world would know who they really were. The days that followed the attempted morphine overdose became the forge where my resolve hardened into steel. The hospital room that had once been a cage transformed into a command center. Mark arrived daily, his briefcase heavier with evidence, his calm presence like an anchor in the storm. Carla joined him, her folders thick with surveillance photos, sworn statements and timelines that connected every thread. Together, they laid out the strategy. The forged death certificate with Charles's signature, the $5 million insurance claim filed by Evelyn, the affidavit Danielle had written swearing I had no dependents, the guardianship petition declaring me incompetent, the footage from the hospital camera capturing Evelyn's hand on the morphine pump, Danielle whispering, "If she talks, everything falls apart," and Charles raising his hand in the hallway, a silent signal. Each piece by itself was damning. Together, they formed a noose. I listened to Mark outline the order of presentation, his voice steady, deliberate. "We will not overwhelm them at once," he explained. "We will let the jury see each brick until the entire wall of deceit towers over them." Carla nodded, adding that arrogance would be their weakness. Danielle cannot keep her composure when cornered. Evelyn thrives on control, but falters when her image cracks. Charles will crumble under pressure because silence cannot save him on the witness stand. Their downfall will not just be legal, it will be psychological. At night, when the nurses dimmed the lights, I forced myself to practice standing with the crutches, each step a battle against pain, but also a rehearsal for the courtroom. I wanted to walk in on my own power, to show them that the daughter they declared dead stood taller than their lies. Marcy visited often, bringing books and quiet comfort. She reminded me of life outside, betrayal of friendship that did not demand subservience. One evening, she held my hand and said, "Rachel, you have already won. They tried to kill you twice, and you are still here. Court will only be the final nail." Her faith fueled me. Yet fear lingered too. What if the jury believed their lies? What if their lawyer twisted the narrative, painting me as unstable? Mark anticipated it. He prepared me with questions, drilling my responses until my voice no longer shook when I recounted the accident, the abandonment, the betrayal. He reminded me that truth has weight, and when spoken steadily, it crushes fabrication. Carla worked behind the scenes, digging deeper. She uncovered records of Evelyn's meetings with shady legal fixers, Danielle's suspicious withdrawals, Charles's signatures appearing on documents filed at odd hours. She even found a nurse willing to testify that Evelyn had requested higher dosages without doctor approval. Piece by piece, the net tightened. The night before my release from the hospital, I sat upright in bed, the folder of evidence spread across my lap. Looking at the forged death certificate made my chest tighten, but it also stoked fury. They had reduced my life to ink on paper, my identity to a line on a form. Looking at the footage still frame of Evelyn and Danielle at my bedside filled me with cold clarity. They had looked at me not as flesh and blood, but as an obstacle to wealth. And seeing Charles's hand lifted in silent signal was the final nail in the coffin of my childhood illusions. My father had never been protector. He had been accomplice all along. That night, I made a vow. When I stepped into the courtroom, I would not simply testify. I would expose them. I would show the jury not only the forged documents, but the emotional scars carved by decades of control and silence. They wanted the world to see me as weak, incompetent dead. I would make sure the world saw them for what they truly were. Predators dressed as family. When dawn broke and the nurses wheeled me out for the last time, the air outside tasted like freedom. I gripped the crutch's sunlight warming my face and felt the weight of months of pain shift into determination. Ahead lay the trial. Ahead lay the moment when their empire of lies would collapse brick by brick. And I, Rachel Miller, would be the one to tear it down. The courthouse on the morning of the trial buzzed with an energy that felt almost electric. Reporters clustered on the steps, microphones angled like weapons cameras flashing as I arrived on crutches with Mark and Carla flanking me. Each step I took was deliberate, a declaration that I had survived what was meant to destroy me. Inside, the air was heavy with murmurs, the scrape of chairs, the shuffle of papers. At the plaintiff's table, Evelyn sat poised, her hair in its usual immaculate bun, her lips painted a shade that screamed control. Danielle leaned beside her, tapping a pen against the folder in front of her, her expression already sour with impatience. Charles sat stiff, his eyes avoiding mine, his shoulders slumped as though the weight of what was coming had finally settled on him. The judge entered and the bailiff called for order. Silence descended thick and expectant. Mark stood, his voice calm but cutting as he opened with a timeline. He spoke of the accident, of the forged certificate, of the insurance claim, each phrase building momentum. The opposing counsel rose, objecting loudly, but the judge overruled more often than not. Piece by piece, the case unfolded, like a trap tightening. The first exhibit was the video from my hospital room. The screen lit up, showing Evelyn adjusting the morphine pump, Danielle leaning in to whisper. If she talks, everything falls apart, and Charles visible in the hallway, signaling with his hand. Gasps rippled through the room. Evelyn's face drained of color. Danielle clenched her fists, and Charles rubbed his temples as if the image itself was unbearable. Next came the forged documents. Mark placed the death certificate on the projector, my name printed in bold under the word, "Deceased," my father's signature scrawled at the bottom. The jury leaned forward, eyes narrowing. Mark explained how this document had been used to freeze my accounts, how Evelyn had submitted it to the insurance company, how Danielle had provided supporting testimony. He presented the guardianship petition, reading aloud, the language that described me as cognitively impaired, reminding the jury that I was standing in front of them alive, speaking clearly. Their lawyer attempted to argue clerical mistakes, but the accumulation was too much. Carla took the stand and delivered her testimony with precision. She described the bank records, the suspicious withdrawals, the meetings between Evelyn and known legal fixers, Danielle's presence at the parking lot with the damaged truck, Charles's signature across multiple documents. Her voice was steady, her details meticulous, and each fact landed like a hammer. Then came my turn. I rose slowly, gripping the crutches, and moved to the witness stand. Every eye followed. I raised my hand, swore the oath, and settled into the chair. My throat tightened, but I forced my voice steady. I described the night Danielle called me, how I found no car, how the truck slammed into me again and again. I described waking in the hospital, asking for my family, and being met with silence. I told the jury how Evelyn came only to request paperwork, how Danielle laughed on the phone that they were handling everything, how Charles sent me a text to obey my mother. My voice shook once when I recounted seeing my father's car slowing near the wreck, then driving away, but I steadied myself. I wanted the jury to feel not only the fraud, but the betrayal. Their lawyer cross-examined, trying to paint me as paranoid, suggesting the accident was coincidence, the documents misunderstandings. But when Mark played the final clip, Danielle's whisper, "It would be better if you slept forever." The courtroom froze. Danielle erupted, slamming her hands on the table. She shouted that I was always weak, that I never deserved anything, that the family had carried me for years. Evelyn grabbed her arm, hissing at her to stop, but the words hung in the air like poison. Then, the twist I had anticipated but dreaded occurred. Evelyn turned her eyes sharp and pointed at Charles. He signed everything she snapped. He pushed it through. Without him, none of this would have worked. Danielle seized the opportunity, her voice rising. Yes, it was him. He was the one who made it real. He is the reason she almost cost us everything. The room erupted. Charles stammered, his hands trembling. I only did what they told me. They pushed me. They demanded. The judge slammed the gavel for order, but the damage was done. The image of a united front cracked into chaos. Mother, sister, father, each turning on the other, their once seamless facade collapsing under the weight of their own greed. The jury watched, wrapped their faces a mixture of disgust and disbelief. The judge called a recess, but the verdict was already echoing in the silence that followed. When the session resumed, the charges were read aloud. Fraud, forgery, conspiracy, attempted murder, accessory to attempted murder. Evelyn's face was pale, Danielle's defiant mask crumbling into tears, Charles's shoulders sagging as though his bones could no longer hold him. The bailiff moved forward, cuffs glinting under the courtroom lights. They were led away one by one, each step a reversal of decades of domination. And I sat there, breathing deeply alive, vindicated, watching the family that had tried to erase me finally collapse under the weight of truth. The verdict delivered in that courtroom reverberated like a bell, tolling the end of a long nightmare. As the gavel came down, the words fraud, forgery, conspiracy, attempted murder, and accessory to attempted murder echoed in every corner, branding themselves into the record and into the lives of those who had once believed themselves untouchable. Evelyn sat frozen for a moment, her manicured hands clenched so tightly, her knuckles blanched, her posture rigid, as if refusing to accept defeat. Danielle's face crumpled into disbelief, her once perfect composure shattering into fragments of panic and rage. Charles simply slumped, the last reserve of denial slipping from his features, leaving behind only the hollow mask of a man who had surrendered his soul long ago. The bailiff approached with steady steps, the metallic click of handcuffs piercing the silence. Evelyn flinched as they were snapped around her wrists, her eyes darting wildly toward the jury, perhaps searching for sympathy, perhaps still hoping someone would rescue her from the web she herself had spun. Danielle thrashed, shouting that it was not fair, that I had twisted everything, that I had ruined the family, but her words bounced off walls already saturated with proof. Charles did not resist, his eyes fixed on the floor, as though if he avoided looking up he could vanish into invisibility. The three of them were escorted past me, and for the first time in my life, I felt taller than Evelyn Freer, than Danielle, stronger than Charles. The reporters outside were relentless microphones, shoved forward cameras flashing the air, filled with questions about how a mother, a sister, and a father could plot the erasure of their own flesh and blood. Mark shielded me as best he could, his steady voice reminding everyone that today was about justice, not spectacle. Yet spectacle it was, the fall of a family once respected, in whispers of community now plastered across headlines as predators exposed. In the days that followed, sentencing hearings unfolded. Evelyn received the harshest punishment, years stretching into decades, for her role as mastermind and beneficiary. Danielle faced nearly as long, her arrogance and direct participation sealing her fate. Charles, though, given a somewhat lighter sentence, could not escape conviction as accessory. His signatures, his silences, his presence outside that hospital room marked him guilty in the eyes of the law and in the eyes of anyone who had ever believed fathers were meant to protect. When the judge read the sentences, I felt a mixture of relief and sorrow. Relief that justice had been served, sorrow that the people who should have been my foundation had instead become my destruction. But grief could no longer control me. Their choices were theirs. My survival was mine. Outside the courthouse, the world reacted. Neighbors whispered that they had suspected Evelyn's hunger for control, but never imagined it would reach such extremes. Old acquaintances expressed shock that Danielle, once praised for her charm, could harbor such cruelty, and whispers about Charles grew sharp, condemning not only his weakness but his active role in legitimizing the scheme. For the first time, the hierarchy that had dominated my life was inverted. They were the pariahs. I was the survivor. In the quiet of my new house with sunlight pouring through clean windows, I began to breathe differently. My accounts were restored, the deed to my home secured in my name. The $5 million that had nearly been stolen now sat under my control, but it no longer represented simple wealth. It was the symbol of freedom, of autonomy, of the life they had tried to crush and failed. Yet freedom was not just financial, it was emotional. The chains of guilt, the weight of believing I had to bend to keep peace, dissolved. I no longer had to answer calls that dripped with manipulation. I no longer had to beg for affection that was never genuine. I no longer had to fear being erased by the people who had raised me. Their downfall was not my triumph in the sense of revenge. It was my triumph in reclaiming myself. Still, nights came when I lay awake remembering Evelyn's cold smile, Danielle's taunts, Charles's silence. Memories do not vanish with verdicts. But each time those images surfaced, I countered them with the image of the gavel coming down the cuffs, snapping closed, the truth carved permanently into law. They could no longer touch me. They could no longer decide my story. Justice had drawn a line they could never cross again. I poured part of the money into causes that mattered, supporting shelters for survivors of abuse, funding legal aid for those gaslit and silenced by families who wielded power as a weapon. Each check I signed felt like rewriting history, transforming the legacy of betrayal into a legacy of hope. The headlines faded slowly, but the impact remained. My name was no longer tied to whispers of weakness. It was tied to survival, to exposure, to justice. And though the scars on my body ached when the weather shifted, and the scars on my heart still throbbed in moments of quiet, I carried them as proof. Proof that I had endured, proof that I had fought back. Proof that I had won. When the courtroom doors closed behind me for the final time, I stepped into a world that for once felt entirely mine. The air outside carried a freshness I had not tasted in months, maybe years, as if justice itself had cleared the sky. I returned to my new house, a modest 2-bedroom with a porch that caught the afternoon sun, and for the first time in my life, I opened a door that belonged solely to me. The walls were bare at first, but their emptiness felt like freedom rather than loss. I unpacked slowly, each item a symbol of independence. My crutches leaned against the wall while I shuffled through boxes arranging books I had saved, pictures with Marcy, small mementos of the life I had fought to keep. Sunlight streamed through the windows, casting warm stripes across the floor, and in that golden light I let myself exhale without fear that someone was listening to judge or control. Healing was not quick. My ribs still ached when I bent too far, my legs stiffened after a few steps, and the scars on my forehead caught my eye every time I passed a mirror. Yet every mark was proof of survival, every ache a reminder that I had endured. Physical therapy became a ritual of reclaiming my body. Each stretch, each step, each painful repetition strengthened not only my muscles, but my will. The therapists marveled at my determination, unaware that compared to surviving my family's betrayal, lifting weights and walking lines was nothing. Marcy remained by my side, bringing laughter back into my life in small doses. We cooked simple meals in my kitchen, burned a few attempts at casseroles, and laughed until the sound echoed through walls that had once been silent. Her friendship grounded me, proof that bonds built on choice and care could outlast blood poisoned by control. I also met others at support groups Carla recommended, women and men who had endured toxic families, gaslighting, abandonment. Listening to their stories mirrored parts of mine, and sharing my own lifted burdens I had carried alone for too long. I realized then that what I had faced was not an isolated cruelty, but part of a pattern many suffered in silence. That recognition drove me to action. With Mark's help, I established a foundation, funding it with a portion of the settlement money. The mission was simple: provide resources for survivors of family abuse, legal aid for those trapped in manipulative control, and safe housing for those with nowhere to turn. Writing the first checks felt like rewriting my family's legacy. Evelyn, Danielle, and Charles had sought to erase me for money. I used that same money to create voices louder than theirs could ever be. Nights on the porch became moments of reflection. I would sit with tea in hand, watching the sky darken into twilight, listening to the crickets in the grass. Sometimes tears fell grief for the childhood I had lost, grief for the family I never truly had. But alongside grief came strength. I had not only survived, but had transformed survival into purpose. And purpose is a kind of healing more powerful than time alone. Slowly, the nightmares faded. The sound of tires on wet asphalt no longer sent me shaking. The echo of Danielle's laughter in my memory grew dim. Evelyn's cold stare lost its power. Even Charles's signature, once the mark of betrayal, became just ink on paper locked in a court file. The people who had once defined my life had become footnotes in the story I now wrote myself. I walked through my garden one morning, leaning less on the cane, and felt the sun warming my face. A neighbor waved, calling out hello, no suspicion, no pity, just simple acknowledgement. It was in that moment I understood I was not living under their shadow anymore. I was living as Rachel Miller, survivor woman, free. To anyone who hears my story, to anyone who has been told they are weak, that they are nothing, that they should stay silent, know this survival is the loudest voice. Living well is the greatest justice. Your existence cannot be signed away, not by forged papers, not by cold words, not even by those who claim to love you. I am here. I am alive. And the life I build now is mine alone. I believed that once the sentencing was complete, the story would end, that my family's downfall would close the chapter for good. But justice has a way of widening when lies run deeper than anyone expected. Weeks after the trial, a journalist knocked on my door, a woman with sharp eyes and a press badge who introduced herself as Dana from the local paper. She asked if I would be willing to comment on rumors that my mother had ties to a wider insurance fraud ring. My pulse quickened, suspicion hardening into dread. I invited her in, and over steaming cups of coffee she revealed documents leaked from federal investigators. Evelyn had not acted alone. She had been in contact for years with a network that specialized in forging death certificates, manipulating bank records, and staging claims. My case had drawn attention because the forged documents had been unusually bold, and when investigators dug, they discovered Evelyn's name linked to multiple suspicious payouts in other counties. Shock coursed through me as Dana showed me photocopies of signed forms, not only in my name, but in the names of strangers who had died under sudden circumstances. Evelyn had served as a witness on at least 3 separate claims. Danielle's name appeared too assisting in smaller roles, while Charles's signature had once again provided legitimacy. What they had tried to do to me was not a desperate one-time betrayal, but part of a larger system, a network that stretched far beyond the walls of my family. Carla confirmed the findings when she arrived days later. She had continued digging, driven by instinct that Evelyn's arrogance masked deeper corruption. With federal contacts, she pieced together the puzzle: doctors who had signed false medical reports, notaries who had stamped forged documents, and fixers who had handled payouts in exchange for hefty cuts. Evelyn had been more than a mother gone rogue. She had been a collaborator in a criminal syndicate. The FBI moved quickly, seizing bank accounts, raiding homes, arresting individuals who had thought themselves invisible. Headlines exploded. What had begun as a shocking family betrayal transformed into a scandal that rocked the state. My mother, sister, and father were no longer just criminals within one family. They became the faces of a conspiracy exposed. Reporters swarmed again this time, not just local, but national. Cameras flashed outside courthouses, anchors spoke my name alongside words like landmark case and insurance fraud crackdown. I found myself at the center of something far larger than I had ever imagined. One evening, I sat on my porch, the television inside, replaying footage of Evelyn in an orange jumpsuit being transferred to federal custody. The woman who had once told me I was weak, that I was nothing, now stood shackled as part of a case that might reshape how insurance fraud was prosecuted across the country. Danielle, too, was dragged further into the spotlight, her arrogance now fueling public outrage. Charles faded as he always had a shadow in the background, but the law had no interest in his silence this time. He would face federal questioning as well. For me, the revelation carried both vindication and sorrow. vindication that my instincts had been right, that their cruelty had always been more calculated than personal, that I had been trapped in a machine they helped run. Sorrow, because it meant my family had never truly been mine. They had been operators, schemers, participants in deception. There was no version of my childhood where love had simply gone wrong. Love had never been there at all. Yet out of that sorrow came a new kind of strength. Dana published her article quoting me as saying, "Survival is not just living through what they did to me. Survival is seeing the truth spread so no one else falls into their trap." Those words appeared on front pages in online news feeds across television screens. People wrote letters, strangers thanking me for standing up, some sharing their own stories of families who tried to silence them for money, for pride, for control. My voice had become larger than my pain. It had become part of a collective roar against corruption. And as federal indictments piled up, I realized that my survival had triggered something far beyond personal justice. It had helped dismantle a network of exploitation. The twist after the trial was not that I simply lived, it was that living exposed rot no one had dared to touch. The morning sunlight spilled across the porch of my home as I held a newspaper in trembling hands, the headline, "Bold and Undeniable, National Insurance Fraud Ring Exposed, Rooted in Local Family Case." My name appeared not as a victim anymore, but as the survivor whose story had set the investigation in motion. For a long time, I sat still, the words blurring through tears that were not of grief but of recognition. What I had endured was now part of a much larger truth. Evelyn, Danielle, and Charles were no longer simply my tormentors. They were figures in a network dismantled by the very evidence they had left behind. I folded the paper and placed it beside me, lifting my face to the sky. The scars on my body ached when the wind shifted, but they no longer felt like chains. They were markers proof etched into skin that I had not only lived, but had transformed the pain into something unbreakable. In the weeks that followed, letters arrived in droves. Survivors wrote to me from across the country, people who had endured families like mine. People who had been silenced or erased, people who now saw in my story a reason to speak. Some letters were short, a single sentence of thanks. Others were pages long, recounting decades of abuse and betrayal. I read each one sometimes with tears, sometimes with fierce pride, always with the conviction that my story mattered not just to me, but to many. With Mark's legal guidance and Carla's unyielding dedication, I expanded the foundation I had started. It became more than a local shelter fund. It grew into a national initiative that provided legal aid therapy and emergency housing. The $5 million my family had once tried to steal became the seed of hope for countless others. Each grant, each safe bed, each case taken on by our lawyers felt like a victory that reached beyond me. Marcy stood with me through it all, her laughter a constant reminder that life could be light as well as heavy. Together, we painted the walls of my home, filled the garden with flowers, and hosted small gatherings where the sound of joy replaced the echoes of silence I had known in childhood. In the evenings, I often returned to the porch with tea in hand, watching the sky darken into twilight. Sometimes I remembered the courtroom, the look on Evelyn's face as the cuffs closed, Danielle's scream, Charles's bowed head. Those memories no longer haunted me. They were simply part of the tapestry proof of where I had come from and how far I had walked. One night, Dana the journalist visited again. She asked if I regretted anything, if I ever wished the family I had exposed could have been different. I thought for a long moment before answering. "I do not regret surviving," I said. "I regret that they chose greed over love, control over compassion, silence over truth. But regret does not bind me anymore. Survival sets me free." Dana's article ended with those words, and they traveled farther than I ever imagined. Schools invited me to speak, advocacy groups asked me to share my journey, and slowly I realized that my voice had become a symbol, not because I was extraordinary, but because I had refused to stay erased. On the anniversary of the trial, I visited the courthouse steps, standing where the cameras had once swarmed, where reporters had shouted questions. The square was quiet now, only the breeze carrying faint echoes. I placed a single white rose on the steps, not for them, but for the part of me that had been buried by their lies and resurrected by truth. I whispered to the air, "I am alive, and my life is mine." Walking back down those steps, the cane tapping lightly, I felt taller than I ever had. The final resolution was not in their sentences or in the headlines. It was in the simple fact that I could breathe freely, plan freely, live freely. Legacy is not built on what was stolen or broken. Legacy is built on what rises after. My legacy would not be defined by Evelyn's greed, Danielle's cruelty, or Charles's silence. It would be defined by the lives touched through the foundation by the survivors who found courage in my story, by the unshakable truth that existence cannot be forged away. And as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in hues of fire and gold, I knew that the greatest justice was not in watching them fall, but in standing here whole-scarred and unafraid, ready to live every day on my own terms.